Yes, I'm Andrew Thomas. I'm the publisher of Communicate magazine. I don't know how well everyone remembers 2008. You've probably all tried to blank it out of your minds, but we launched Craven Hill Publishing in August 2008. And then our very first issue of Communicate magazine came out in November 2008. And in between those 2 months, Lehman Brothers collapsed, governments ended up coming to the rescue of large financial institutions, a global economic crisis began. By rights, we should never have seen a second issue. However, we went on, we won, the following year we won Launch of the Year, we went on the following year to win Media Brand of the Year, and hasn't all been plain sailing, but it's been fantastic fun over the past 3 years. And it would be great to think that that's because we're just fantastic publishers. Sadly, that's not really the reason. It's because we were very lucky, really. We were very lucky to have launched a magazine in corporate communications at a time, excuse me, at a time when communications was really changing. We don't just publish, I'm not going to talk about Communicate magazine, by the way, for very much longer, but we don't just publish, I want to put it in context, we don't just publish Communicate magazine, we also organise the Transform Awards, which benchmarks rebranding, repositioning, brand transformation. We organise the Digital Impact Awards, which rewards excellence in digital corporate communications. We organise the Corporate Engagement Awards, which looks at mutually beneficial corporate sponsorships, partnerships and philanthropy. And we organise a number of conferences, such as Social Media in a Corporate Context, Reputation and Financial Services, the Transform Conference and so on. And I think that's why AIMediaComs asked me to come along today, because we publish magazines just about corporate communications. Our events are just about corporate communications and business. And we've noticed a lot of changes in corporate communications. It's changed phenomenally, really, over the past 5 years. There's been a tremendous convergence. Certainly a convergence of discipline and responsibility, but actually, more importantly, a convergence of audience, a convergence of content, a convergence of channels, and I'm going to come on and talk about those. We don't do any of that. We're not in-house corporate communications practitioners. We're not even advisors of companies. We're just observers. Observers and actually confidants to some degree as well. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that we've observed and some of the things that people are telling us, what the trends are and where we're going and how we're getting there. So let's just start briefly talking about the convergence of discipline. I'm not going to make this a history lesson, so I'm going to be brief on it. But firstly, can I just have a show of hands from everyone? Who here is within a corporate communications department? Who has responsibility for an aspect of corporate communications? That's 92.3%, I think. Okay, now can you put your hands up again if you've got media relations responsibility? Okay, hands up if you've got internal comms responsibility. Okay, hands up if you've got investor relations responsibility. Okay, so I don't know, you probably, if you're sitting at the front, you haven't the faintest idea what it was like behind. You may be the only person with your hand up. If you're at the back, obviously you know what everyone else was doing. But I think the interesting thing there is that you are all working within the same discipline. You're all working within corporate communications, and yet a lot of you have got responsibility for all of those areas. Some of you are sitting alongside people within your department who's got responsibility for talking to a very different audience to your own audience. You've got responsibility for communicating in different ways and so on and so forth. And basically we've seen this convergence of those disciplines, of the roles that you do, really come together. And that is actually a very, very recent trend. I'm going to tell you something about someone who I think is an oft-forgotten hero in the corporate communications world. Someone who I think should have a blue plaque outside. Oh, and actually, I think you've got to be dead to have a blue plaque, so I think he's still alive, so best not wish that. Has anyone heard of a man called Eric Sylvester? No one. You see, I told you he was very forgotten. He was the very first investor relations officer in the UK, and he had a number of problems. First, he had a problem getting people to take his name seriously. This was the late 70s, and Monty Python were talking about Eric, and Eric was very much a comedy name. More importantly, he had a problem getting people to take his company's name seriously. He worked for BOC, formerly British Oxygen. They just dropped British. They were pilloried in the press because they seemed to be abandoning Britain, obviously in an opportunity to reach out to a global marketplace. He had another problem, which was getting people to take his CEO's salary seriously. Richard Giordano was the first £1 million CEO. But more importantly, he had a problem getting people to take his role seriously. As the first investor relations officer, his role obviously was to talk to investors and analysts about his company's organisation, his company's financial performance and so on. Up until then, analysts and investors would just get in touch with the management. And he needed to have as much credibility. He and obviously his peers at the time needed to have credibility. And therefore, the very first investor relations officers shied very much away from any correlation of spin or hype or marketing. And so did a very technical role of shareholder analysis, of organisation of results meetings and so on and so forth. And I think what we've seen now is a recognition that this is a role that is, of course, very important. And so we've seen acceptance of what investor relations officers do. And over the past 30 years, as investor relations officers have become more and more widespread to the point where I think 99% now of FTSE 100 companies have a head of IR. We've seen actually them embracing, for example, a media relations role. We've seen them coming together and having responsibility, in the case of Centrica, for investor relations and internal comms as well. And we've seen, again, this kind of convergence. Because prior to that, everything was very siloed. The investor relations officer reported to the CFO, internal comms reported to human resources, corporate PR reported into probably a centralised press office, which in turn reported into marketing and so on. And we've seen everything start to come together. And I think that's been obviously very important. I could talk about kind of the reasons for that for ages, and actually we discussed one of them, which was the growth of the intangible asset. But there's things such as regulatory changes brought about by the Thatcher privatisation programme, about transparency initiatives brought in by the Blair government, and so on and so forth. But all of this is kind of a bit historic, and certainly before Communicate's time. But what I'm going to do is look at something that is a little bit newer, and that is the convergence of your audiences, which again actually was something mentioned just before. Companies need obviously to start talking to those audiences with a single voice, because your employees are now very often your shareholders. Your customers, through blogs, have become city street journalists, effectively reviewing, critiquing, commenting on your company's products, services, and reputation. And effectively now are, as I say, reviewers rather than just passive users. And because of this transformation, companies need to talk to their audiences with that single voice. And that leads us very neatly on to the next area of convergence, which is convergence of content. Companies are having to bring together this content to talk to those various audiences in that same voice. And I'll give you a couple of examples from things that we've noticed recently. Last year, at last year's Digital Impact Awards, we saw the Silver Prize go to First Direct for Best Online Newsroom. I can't actually remember now. Oh, SAP Miller won gold. But First Direct is the one that sort of stuck in my mind. They previously had on their website an area which was called, I don't know, news releases or press releases or something, which was just single links through to either a PDF or a Word document that was just the news release. And probably many people have that here. Actually, just out of interest, for my interest really more than anything else, how many people here have social media newsrooms? Wow, that's quite incredible. None for those at the front who couldn't see what people were doing behind. Well, First Direct changed their newsroom. They were having 5 visitors on average so well, some weeks more, some weeks presumably none, visitors to that area on their website which contained all their news releases. And at the same time, they had a wealth of different content for different audiences. They had sort of a whole load of engagement, non-market sensitive type stuff for the internal audience. They had a whole load of investor stuff, maybe obviously things like the annual reports, IMSs, and so on. Maybe kind of videos of the chairman's presentation perhaps. They had a whole load of CSR stuff, and it was all documents, PDFs, video, photos, quite a lot of rich content. And they brought that all together and put it where they felt it should be, which is on their newsroom. So they went from 5 visitors a week to their newsroom area of their website. Well, the growth, I thought the growth was quite impressive. I don't know what people would think impressive looked like, what good growth would be. If you had a base of 5, to see good growth, where would people think that good growth would end up? Give me some figures. Anyone want to guess? 100. Wasn't 100? That would be good growth. 20%, sorry, 20-fold growth. It was more than 100. Any other guesses?
500.
500. No, it was 2,000. They went from 5 visitors to 2,000 by bringing their content together, because now suddenly they were able not just to talk to those different audiences, but also to talk to them with different forms of content. That's obviously a very literal case. We had a conference last year on our Transform conference, actually, on rebranding. And we had Stephen Payne speaking, who was the acting Senior Vice President of Global Communications. And I say acting because actually his role and his remit was really to make sure that he engineered himself out of a job. Because what he did, and it's quite a fascinating case, was that he looked very carefully at the way that the corporate brand had no real relevance currently, or at the time he did that look, to the consumers. And that's quite often the case, you know.